Before I begin, let me preface this by saying that this is my opinion. Not professional opinion, not an opinion of someone with an insurmountable amount of knowledge on game engines, just my opinion. And there's a lot of nitpicking, but I figured this was the best way to express my thoughts. In September of 2023, Unity announced plans that they were going to charge developers based on the number of installations their games had, at about 20 cents per install. Although they eventually backtracked a bit, a lot of developers big and small finally decided they'd had enough of Unity's nonsense, and would be switching engines. As someone who has been using Unity since 2015, I can definitely understand why people are jumping ship, and I'm looking to do the same. And one of the first options that came to mind was Godot. I've used Godot for a couple of game jams previously, but I never jumped into it from the programming side of things. I found it quite difficult to work with back then, as the node system was quite confusing to me. Earlier this year, Global Game Jam happened, and in the lead up to it, I decided to properly sit down and learn the engine. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from a month of use. Let's begin from the very start, installing and starting a project. Godot uses a portable launcher so you can run it immediately without any lengthy installation process. Example projects are downloaded separately. After that, start a new project and it basically opens instantly. Godot does pride itself on being lightweight, so I'm not surprised by any of this. Unity, on the other hand, can take minutes to load a project unless you run it off an SSD, but even then, the wait time is still quite lengthy by comparison. Godot made such a strong impression on me in that regard that I felt the need to add it into this script. During my month-long stint with it, I made 3 things. The tutorial game that's in Godot's 3D documentation, a Pong clone, and the Global Game Jam game I already made a video on. The tutorial is fairly simple. It teaches you to make a game where you move around, jump, and stomp on enemies for points. It holds your hand a lot and gives you all the code you need. While I was streaming this process, a few people popped up in my chat and gave me some additional information that's not in the tutorial. For example, the tutorial teaches you to make a floor using a cube mesh instance 3D, and then applying a static body 3D to it. However, a person in my chat told me about CSG Box 3D, which handles both the mesh and the collisions together in one node. There is some overlap in the functionality of nodes that I will touch on later. Continuing on, Godot does provide some nodes that are quite useful. In the tutorial, they make use of the Visible On-Screen Notifier 3D node, which lets you execute code when an object enters or exits the screen. Now, I was going to say that Unity doesn't have anything like this, but actually there are mono behaviors called onBecomeVisible and onBecomeInvisible that handle this behavior. I just wasn't aware of them before making this video. But I would say that Godot's documentation tends to provide better examples for use cases. Furthermore, the tooltips are also crammed with excessive detail, sometimes taking up more than half the height of the screen just to explain a single option. Moving on, the next game was a simple Pong clone. Now, my idea of making Pong is probably different from others. My basic idea is to have 2 players that can move up and down, and then a ball that has adjustable physics. The latter was the most difficult part. Most people would probably be happy with slapping the default physics onto a ball and calling it a day. Although in my case, when I did that, the physics weren't right and the ball kept slowing down. Upon consulting with my friend, he did some digging into Godot's settings and found that by default, there's an angular drag variable, which you can't adjust in the inspector for the specific rigid body 3D node, but rather have to go into the project settings to adjust. For comparison, angular drag is a variable on Unity's rigid body component. Regardless, I opted not to use the rigid body 3D node and instead used the character body 3D node for the ball. But before I get to that, let me explain something. There are 3 physics body nodes for objects: a static body, a character body, and a rigid body. I'm not going to explain what the differences are between them, but I do want to point out that Unity only has one rigid body component, with a good amount of customizability, if you want to make it kinematic and so on. So when given this choice in Godot without really knowing what the differences are, I was a bit bewildered. That said, I don't think there needs to be as many different physics body nodes as there are, and I do prefer the Unity method in this case. Getting back to the point, I used the character body 3D node on the ball, as it was the only option that would let me directly control its velocity, despite the fact that the ball isn't actually a character. A small note on collision detection. You can no doubt see from the footage that it doesn't work correctly. If I were doing this in Unity, I would be comparing the tags of objects I collide with. Godot does have a similar system, but I forgot how it worked, so I made an alternative that checks the names of objects instead. Unfortunately, it's not a great system. Specifically, colliding with the player and the boundaries isn't uniform. I'll chalk this one up as my fault. I've already done a video about my global game jam game earlier in the year, so I won't go over it again. Outside of specific projects, I have some more general opinions on aspects of Godot. The user interface for the editor is a bit of a mess. Everything feels messy and improperly laid out. Using the inspector is nowhere near as clean and easy as Unity is, and adding nodes involves going through multiple nested lists of stuff unless you explicitly know what you're looking for, then you can search for it instead. I also really dislike their choice in font, although that's a very personal preference. It does, however, serve its purpose, even if I don't find it particularly appealing. The UI is a real sticking point for me, which is why I put off learning the engine for so long. It makes a terrible first impression because of it. There are a lot of menus, tabs, nested lists, and nested sections within nested sections. Going from Unity to this... Unity isn't the greatest UI-wise, but I can say it feels a bit more sensible than this. As for the UI tools you can use, they're fine. I haven't explored it much, but I do know you can build themed UI where all the buttons, text, and so on will have a uniform look. I haven't touched it much personally, but I do think it sounds like a cool feature. Moving on to nodes. Nodes are a substantial aspect of Godot, but they're not quite the same as Unity's components. In Unity, you make an empty game object and attach components to it, like a collider, sprite renderer, mesh renderer, etc. In Godot, you choose a root node, which can be an empty node, a 3D node, a 2D node, a control node, or one of many more specific nodes like a physics body node. Once you've made that choice, other components get added as child nodes. What you need to be aware of, however, is that certain nodes require specific child nodes to be directly parented to them. I believe I mentioned an example of this in my Global Game Jam video last time, where the vehicle body node required a collider to be directly assigned to it. We solved that problem by spawning in the character body model and reparenting the collider to the vehicle body node in a less than elegant solution. The sheer number of nested nodes can get a bit ridiculous at times, especially as a project gets bigger. Breaking things up into scenes helps a bit. I remember when myself and my friend were working on a game for a Global Game Jam 2022, which was a 3D platformer. We found that placing each node as a platform was a bit tedious when making a whole level, so we broke the level into sections, which were their own scenes, and put all those scenes back together into the level. There were a few small issues with spacing out stuff, but it did make managing all the things in the level a bit easier. Another example are the characters in the Global Game Jam 2024 game that just went, where the vehicle body with wheels, the character model itself, and the weapons that are attached to them are all separate scenes that you can open in isolation. We had to do that because the models and the weapons are swappable. Originally, everything was going to be attached to the player and toggled on or off as needed. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to do, and in hindsight, probably not the best implementation anyway. But the node hierarchy, if we did go through with it, would have been an absolute mess to manage. In Unity, you can use getComponent or findObject by tag to access specific components or game objects respectively, and those can be either one or many. You can also pass objects directly into the inspector if you want. Godot is a bit puzzling in this regard, although admittedly I was probably doing it wrong. There is a getNode function, but this only returns one node. Earlier I mentioned something called groups, which functions similar to Unity's tag system. With that you can assign multiple objects to that group and call them all at once. Furthermore, you can use it to get multiple nodes of a type, but it does need to be part of the same tree or possibly the root. And that's one of the ways you can get multiple nodes. Much like Unity, you can pass objects into the inspector as well. Godot does have reusable objects, much like Unity's prefabs. However, from my experience, you can't drag and drop them into the inspector. You have to load them via code instead. It's not a big problem, but do remember to spell things correctly. Also, you need to load it as the correct type, which caught me out a few times when I was learning it. In Unity, you can just label it as a game object and call it a day. But in Godot, you sometimes need to load it as a more specific node, and occasionally the specific node you want to load it as cannot be instantiated via code. For example, I couldn't load players as vehicle body nodes, but I could load them as type player, and from there access what I needed, but even doing that required casting the data type. As for the overall programming experience, I have no major complaints. You can use the built-in editor or whatever external editor you want. I used Visual Studio. Naming conventions and such are different, but not wildly so. Accessing functions in code like Godot's equivalent of onCollisionEnter can be annoying to set up as there's no pre-built methods like monobehavior. You have to link functions manually, but you can get past that. Like I said, nothing major, so I'll move on. There are a few extra miscellaneous points I want to make before I get to my conclusion. I mentioned this in my last video, but many nodes may not behave in the way you'd expect out of the box, and in some cases may be very broken. Open source software is what it is. I mentioned the specific example of the vehicle body node not really working correctly with the flaw we had in the game, and it required a lot of tweaking far beyond the recommended values in the tooltips to get working correctly. Fiddling with values isn't a huge problem, but when the recommended values are considerably lower than the ones you need to get the thing you're doing working, it does make me scratch my head a bit. My recommendation is to keep an eye on the GitHub page for issues with specific nodes and work around any obstacles. Fast prototyping in Godot is a compelling experience. There's more than enough primitives to make damn near anything you want. Furthermore, the CSG tools provide even more customization, which you can use to create more elaborate levels and environments. Although having many CSG nodes apparently bogs down performance, you'll eventually have to switch to a more optimized mesh. Thankfully, there is an exporter tool you can use to bring whatever you want into a 3D modeling tool like Blender. Looking through the documentation, I also see something called grid maps, which is a way of placing a series of predefined 3D meshes on a grid, like a 3D version of tile maps. I haven't used those personally, but they certainly seem useful. In my personal experience, building levels in Godot has been a fairly favourable experience thanks to these options. But I still do like Unity's Pro Builder tools. With Unity, each scene is a scene. It's an environment where all the game objects for a level or section exist, and you put all those scenes together to make a game. In Godot, which I have explained at this point, scenes are also game objects. So what does that mean? When you start Godot, you have to initialize a root node for the initial project scene. If you're doing a one-screen game like Pong or something, you might call that node main game and be done with it. But if you're making a multi-level project, it would be wise to use a game manager as a root node that can let you load and unload specific scenes. Unity does this for you with the scene management library, but with Godot it seems like you'll have to handle it yourself. So with that in mind, large-scale projects might become very difficult to deal with at some point if you're the type of person who is likely to get corrupted by feature creep. Godot might become frustrating to deal with as you tack more and more things on. If you're going to do something big, plan it out properly. Believe me, losing control of your scope gets out of hand really, really fast and will leave you very disheartened and disillusioned with your own projects. Sorry to the people who were looking forward to that space game I was working on some years ago. So what's my overall gut feeling about it compared to Unity? Well, it hasn't convinced me to switch over completely. I think it needs to mature a bit more. It reminds me of using Blender many years ago and how rough that was. But now you look at it, more and more professionals are switching to it because of how feature-rich it has become, and the general workflow is greatly improved. And I like to think that Godot can get to that point, but it's still not there for me yet. But does this mean that I'm not going to use it again? No. There is a game idea that I think its 2D toolset would work quite well with, but I'm preoccupied with Cyber Surfer and various other things at the moment, so I'll have to wait. Furthermore, the friend I frequently do game jams with swears by this engine, so I'll likely end up using it again whether I want to or not. I hope you guys enjoyed my blunt, unpolished, and generally untechnical opinions on Godot. My apologies for taking months to actually get around to making this video. I've been struggling to figure out what kind of format this video should be, whether it should be a super technical video or just me complaining about things, and ultimately ended up with some weird informal mix of both. And sorry if my voice is boring to listen to. Reading from a script isn't easy for me. As for the next game engine I'll look at, well, I do have Flax installed, but I also want to give Raylib a look as well. However, it'll be some time before I make any videos about them. Just before I go, I have a few things to talk about. I'm releasing a new weapon prop that you can use as an asset in your games. It's a pistol. It's modeled, textured, and has some animations attached to it that you can use. And if you're wondering, yes, this is a slightly improved version of the gun model we used in the 7-day FPS game, but now it's textured. It's not free, but it is cheap. On that note, the shotgun asset pack I released a while back is getting a permanent discount. 4 shotguns textured with animations. Do check out the itch.io pages for both of those. Half the money goes to me and the other half goes to my friend who did the modeling and rigging. It helps us both out. And on the off chance that the next video I work on doesn't come out before then, I will be doing a birthday sale on itch.io from the 26th of May with all the stuff I sell there. It'll be one day only. You may have already seen these at this point, but I made new assets for my streams. The gaming scenes are based on an arcade featuring some machines that might seem familiar, and the game dev scene is a nice little apartment scene looking over a cityscape. They're a bit of a work in progress at the moment, and I'm making small changes to them and improving them, but I wanted to show them off here for the few that don't watch my streams. As for the next video, I'm going to be talking about the current state of Cyber Surfer's development. I would struggle to call it an update video, but I do want to talk about things. Anyway, if you like what I do, subscribe, leave a comment, etc. If you want to throw money at me for whatever reason, there's a Ko-fi link in the description. And there's also a link to my itch.io page if you want to take a look at the stuff I work on. And I'll see you guys next time.